All right, so we're going to finish up this first unit on women by getting into the suffrage movement here, women's suffrage. So it's pretty easy to pinpoint the start of the women's suffrage movement. It happened with the Seneca Falls Convention, which you should remember from APUSH or American 1 and 2. So the Seneca Falls Convention is the first convention ever organized for women's rights in the United States, and it was in July of 1848, held in Seneca Falls in New York. It was organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. This is Elizabeth Stanton right here, this curvy lady here in the middle. I can never remember which one of those women is Lucretia Mott. I've looked up her picture 100 times. I can never figure it out, but that's definitely Elizabeth Stanton. Now, it was attended by about 300 people, not just women, men as well. Elizabeth Stanton's husband was there. Frederick Douglass was there. And during this convention, they were there to talk about a variety of women's issues. A lot of these women were abolitionists. They were talking about abolitionist work. And during the convention, Elizabeth Stanton said that I think women should be allowed the right to vote. I think it's ridiculous that women don't have suffrage in the United States. That's what we need to be working on. That should be our top priority, is it getting women the vote. And people laughed at her. They were like, "You're insane. Oh my God, you're crazy. Women aren't going to vote." Even the women in the room couldn't believe it. Her husband left the convention. He was there to support women's issues, but he couldn't support women's suffrage. He couldn't believe it. He was like, "Elizabeth, you've really lost it now. You're too far gone." And then Frederick Douglass got up and was like, "Y'all are dumb. We need to listen to Liz, okay? She knows the deal. Women need to vote. African Americans need to vote. Everybody needs to be able to vote. That's the whole point of our country, is to have a voice. You're crazy if you don't agree." And once Frederick Douglass, a man, supported women's suffrage, so did everybody else. So they decided to write a declaration of sentiments. Pretty controversial, like I said, even at the time, the people who were there at the convention at first thought it was kind of crazy. Pretty radical, on the whole. But in all, what it did was rewrite the Declaration of Independence. And instead of the United States declaring our independence from Great Britain, it was like women declaring their independence from the oppression of the patriarchy. It says that all men and women are created equal. And it listed grievances that the U.S. government has committed against women, how they've taxed them without their consent. Doesn't that sound familiar? How they've violated their rights. And it demanded a change in behaviors that had led to the inequality, and it kicked off this right to vote. So after this, dozens of conventions were held all over the country to drum up support. And Elizabeth Stanton really connected with this lady down here. This is Susan B. Anthony. Really connected with Susan B. Anthony, who, loved the convention, was a hardcore pro-suffrage woman. And they really wanted to fight for women's suffrage. But when the war broke out, they all agreed that the war was more important, and ending the Civil War had to be everyone's top priority. So they put things on hold to focus on abolition. When 1866 comes, the war is over, it's back to business. So at that point, Elizabeth Stanton and Susan B. Anthony founded the American Equal Rights Association and began pushing for universal suffrage, African American suffrage, and women's suffrage, universal suffrage. Now, we know that radical Republicans in Congress were already pushing for the suffrage of African American men. That was part of those Reconstruction amendments, right? 13, 14, 15. 15 gave African American men the right to vote. So when this amendment came up for vote and passed Congress and went out to the states for ratification, it caused a major rift in the American Equal Rights Association. Some people thought, absolutely not. We can't support this. It's another suffrage amendment without including women. This is just, we're giving them the opportunity to leave us out. We should demand women are a part of this, and we shouldn't support the bill unless women are a part of this. And other people were like, No, any improvement is improvement. Like progress, we should be happy with all progress. So it really caused a big split. And Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton were on the don't support it side, and Lucy Stone, who we talked about when we were talking about women in reform, and Frederick Douglass were on the do support it side. So they actually divided and ended up forming two separate suffrage groups moving forward. Elizabeth Stanton and Susan B. Anthony had the National Woman Suffrage Association, and Lucy Stone and Frederick Douglass and others were all members of the American Women's Suffrage Association. So the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association. And then NASA, or I guess not NASA, the National Women's Suffrage Association, their campaign against the 15th Amendment, it got racist. I mean, it was really, looking back, pretty unacceptable. Susan B. Anthony said she'd rather, cut off her own arm than let a black man vote. And I have no doubt that there was some serious racism in that statement, but on top of that, what she was trying to get across, I believe, / hope, is, well, other than the fact that she probably just didn't think that black men were more, or men in general, or black people in general, were more important than white people, that there should not be an amendment that involves voting that leaves women out. But after all that African Americans have been dealing with for the last 100 years, it's a huge step in a very positive direction to give African American men the right to vote. So this, like I said, caused a big rift. Susan B. Anthony, though, she kept doing her thing. She got arrested about 100 times or more illegally voting. In 1872, she tried to vote in the presidential election, and that was a big deal. She was arrested, put on trial, U.S. versus Susan B. Anthony, and it was the trial of the century. Everyone was reading about this trial. The judge, of course, dude, all the lawyers, dudes. Of course, the entire jury, dudes. And the judge literally told the jury to find her guilty. It was like not even an option. He was just like, straight up, she broke the law. This is it. You have to find her guilty. Like, there's no way around it. When asked if she had any remarks before the sentencing, she went in. She berated the judge, the jury, the trial. This whole thing is a scam. This whole country is a scam. Like, absolutely lost it. Of course, they found her guilty, and she was fined $100, which she refused to pay because she's Susan B. Anthony. But they didn't force her to buy prison time, because had they, then she could have appealed it and potentially, had that case make it to the Supreme Court and potentially have earned women the right to vote in a Supreme Court case, which is not something they were willing to risk. So they didn't want to force her to pay it, so they just sort of let her get away with it. And during that time, we were starting to see success for women. In 1869, Wyoming became the first state to grant women the right to vote, and several other western and frontier states followed suit in the next years. It was really a lot easier to get it done in western states because there was far less people. Additionally, women in western states had a much more independent and responsible and I guess you could say a more important role in society because there was so much more of a shared burden because there was less people and it's the frontier. You're starting from the ground up. So there was more respect for women in a lot of those areas. In 1878, the Women's Suffrage Amendment was first introduced to Congress. We know it's not going to get passed anytime soon, but other activist groups aside from the National Women's Suffrage Association or the American Women's Suffrage Association supported it. The AFL, the American Federation of Labor, they endorsed suffrage. The Populists supported suffrage. So this is something that just kept rolling once they got support. The NWSA, the National Women's Suffrage Association, their tactics were definitely more aggressive. Like Susan B. Anthony, the woman was not getting herself arrested all the time, and things started to calm down for them though by the 1880s, and they had been focused on a federal amendment for a while. While the American Women's Suffrage Association was going state by state. When the Senate voted down the National Women's Suffrage Association's amendment in 1887, they felt like maybe the state-by-state campaign was the way to go, and maybe the American Women's Suffrage Association was right because they had already achieved the right to vote in a few states. So in 1890, the two groups merged once more and became known as the National American Women's Suffrage Association, with Susan B. Anthony serving as the vice president and Elizabeth Stanton serving as the president. Now, after the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association merge back together, we sort of see this like new generation of suffragette born and start to emerge. It's a much more, these younger women, part of NASA, but also starting to become suffragettes for the first time. We're getting into the progressive era. We're leaving the 1800s behind and getting into the 20th century, and we're definitely seeing this new woman, right? We're seeing more independent women. The progressive era is in full swing, so we're seeing women taking on a much more broader role. They are involved in the war. There's, not necessarily like fighting in World War I, but they're definitely serving in a variety of capacities in World War I. They're fighting for change on every front, and we see that play out in this like new generation of suffragettes as well. After Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton and Anna Howard Shaw and all of these older suffragettes died, and this newer, younger group begins to take power. The new president of NASA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, was a woman named Carrie Chapman Catt, CCC, Carrie Chapman Catt, and she was considered to be a society woman, which meant she was like wealthy and upper class. She didn't work, she just did like charity events, like those types of people. And she was definitely a true believer in this state by state campaign. She was a Democrat for the most part. The NASA group was a group of Democrats. There were some Republicans, though, and she wanted to support the president. She wanted to support Wilson. She wanted to, work with politicians, schmooze people, be diplomatic. But even young, she was probably like in her 50s and 60s when she was president of NASA. The younger, we're talking about women in their 20s and 30s, these women are coming from a very different perspective. We're seeing a lot of women who are educated in Britain and had been involved in the British suffrage movement, which was a much more radical movement, very violent, women throwing bricks through windows and burning members of Parliament's houses to the ground if they didn't support suffrage and things like that. So the face of that side of the movement was a woman named Alice Paul. She was a Quaker. She had been educated at Oxford. She had been in that British women's suffrage movement, and when she moved home, she was a member of NASA, and she was part of their DC campaign to garner a national amendment. And Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul really butted heads, and it really came down to like goals and strategies. Alice Paul wanted to recruit everyone's help. She wanted black women, white women, poor women, rich women, all women to work together for a national amendment. Carrie Chapman Catt, definitely coming from a more conservative side. She wanted white upper class women to work with politicians to achieve the state by state campaign. And ultimately they butted heads so much that Alice Paul ended up leaving NASA and founding her own group called the National Women's Party, or the NWP, and their sole goal was to obtain a national amendment to the Constitution to grant women the right to vote. And she was definitely a much more hardcore activist. And definitely of all of the protests that she did, the most controversial one, and the one that she's the most remembered for, is the picketing in front of the White House. People didn't picket in front of the White House back then. I know now there's always someone, but back then it was considered very rude and distasteful, potentially treasonous, definitely not something a woman would do. And these women, she had women from the National Women's Party stand out front of the White House every single day, all day, sun up to sundown, holding signs. You can see these pictures here. Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? Mr. President, you say liberty is the fundamental demand of the human spirit. Sort of throwing his words back at him, because at the time President Wilson was entering the United States into World War I and saying that we needed to make the world safe for democracy, but not all American citizens had democracy. So they were really trying to call him out in his hypocrisy, which brought the hammer down and got a lot of these women arrested. Most of them were charged with obstruction of traffic, a bogus charge that they obviously wouldn't plead guilty to, so they were sent to a workhouse outside of D.C. Eventually, Alice Paul was in the groups, and she began a hunger strike, which made headlines once she started to become force-fed, which is a very violent endeavor that involves a metal clamp in your mouth and shoving a rubber tube down your throat and into your stomach and dumping raw eggs down it. They force-fed her numerous times to keep her alive, because had she died in prison, that would have made them look even worse. But eventually, she was able to get the word out about what was going on, and that, caused a huge uproar. You can't say you take care of women when you're force feeding them. So finally, that was one of the things to sort of push the whole situation over the edge. And President Wilson finally went to Congress and requested that they support and pass an amendment to the Constitution to grant women the right to vote. It passed and went on to a state-by-state ratification, where Tennessee became the last state needed to ratify it. It was a very dramatic vote. It came down to one congressman who, in the middle of the vote, got a telegram from his mother. And he had been going in planning to vote against the bill. After reading the telegram from his mother, we don't know what it said, but we do know that after he wrote it, he stood up and voted yes. And that was how it passed. And so the 19th Amendment to the Constitution officially gave women the right to vote and went into effect in 1920.